Now, obviously, the reading of a book is a neurological phenomenon. It is reading these words on the page that are triggering certain responses in our brains, in our neurology. Obviously, we're reading these things at a normal reading pace. We're reading them in seconds. But there are quite a lot of tiny things, quite important things that are going on in our minds during that 1.5 seconds. This was best explained, I think, by the science fiction writer Samuel R. Delany, who used the first line of one of his science fiction novels to illustrate how each word that we read will redefine the words that we've already read. And the sentence was, okay, the first word was the. And Delany said that, okay, to him, the word the definite article, you know something's there, but you don't know what it is yet. So he imagined the word the as a kind of an ellipse, an oval, a grey oval just hanging there in space. The second word was red, the red. Okay, his grey ellipse has changed to a red ellipse. The third word was sun, the red sun. So, all right, his red ellipse has now become a circle, and it has risen a little bit higher in his imaginary picture. The next word, the red sun is. Okay, this is the present tense, so he immediately feels a little bit more engaged because this is something that's happening right now, whereas if it was the past tense, you'd feel perhaps a little distanced from it. Okay, the red sun is. The next word, high, comma. Okay, so your red circle has now moved right to the top of your imaginary picture. The next word, the. The red sun is high, we've got another grey ellipse. The next word, blue. The red sun is high, the blue, so the grey ellipse has turned blue. The last word is low, full stop. The red sun is high, the blue, low. We are immediately transported to an entirely alien landscape that has two suns, one red, one blue. They are both casting shadows in different directions, and probably at the intersection of those shadows, the shadows are violet. We are immediately upon a completely extraterrestrial planet, and that is all accomplished with 7 words in the right order. So, why do words impact with us? Why do they affect us that much? I think that this might have something to do with a phenomenon discovered relatively recently called mirror neurons. Apparently, we all have mirror neurons in our brain. And if we are watching somebody, say, rowing a boat, then it turns out that exactly the same areas in our brains will light up as if we were rowing a boat. It's like we get a ghostly echo in our neurology of the things that we are looking at. And I suspect that this is the same whether we're looking at this in real life or if we're looking at it in a film. For example, with myself, if I'm watching a film where somebody is in danger of falling from a great height, if they're on a window ledge or if they're hanging out of the door of an aeroplane, I will immediately find that my palms start to perspire until they're dripping wet. The soles of my feet will start to cringe. It's a really anxious and unpleasant physical experience. Also, even if someone were to write compellingly enough about such a scene, I would get exactly the same reaction. And I think that this is all down to mirror neurons. So obviously, when we interact with writing, there is something quite unusual going on. It brings to mind one of the marvellous tricks that William Shakespeare used. And I don't know how he did this, but With modern brain imaging techniques, we have been able to hook up people's brains so we can see what kind of patterns of activity are being activated, and then give them some Shakespeare to read. It turns out that one of the things that people like most about Shakespeare is his wordplay. There was a phrase, I'm not sure which book or play this was from, but the phrase was, "Wouldst thou lip a board?" Now, what Shakespeare's done here is he has changed a noun into a verb, i.e. he's used the word lip to mean kind of kiss. Wouldst thou kiss? Wouldst thou lip a board? Board, he has taken the word bawdy, which is an adjective, and he's changed it into a noun. Bawdy, so a board in context would mean a loose woman, a strumpet, a harlot, something like that. But when Shakespeare does this stuff, it turns out our neurology goes crazy. It becomes really excited because something unusual is being done with language, and practically our entire consciousness is made of language. So by messing about with it, Shakespeare is able to excite our neurons. And he only does this, and he must have done this instinctively because he didn't have brain imaging technology, but he only does this just before an important dramatic denouement. He gets our brains primed with his clever wordplay so that they're excited, they're up for something, they want something exciting to happen, and then he gives us his big dramatic resolutions. This is the power of language over our minds. If we alter the mode of the language, if we mess about and translate it into something that we don't quite understand, then we become very neurologically excited. Try and put your words together in a way that they have not necessarily been put together before. Try to avoid cliches. Try to avoid saying things, try to avoid using phrases that every other writer that you've ever read has used. There are ways of constantly making your language more adventurous, more surprising. I think that is a big element of it. It's the element of surprise, that as the readers are going along, they will suddenly have their attention captured by a surprising image, a startling use of words. One of the ways that you can achieve this is by the principle of juxtaposition. If you put two words together that seem perhaps initially to be dissonant or discordant and not really to fit together, then that will be a technique by which you can occasionally create a kind of beautiful disfigurement, as in the phrase, beautiful disfigurement. There are people who use language wonderfully, inventively, to great effect. I can remember my friend, the writer Steve Aylett. His prose is generally hilarious, is completely hallucinatory. He puts words together and phrases and concepts in a way that I've never seen anybody else do. It's extraordinary. It makes whatever he is writing about is guaranteed to be an enthralling piece of text. It's a bit like, say, the writings of James Joyce, where he was doing all of this incredibly intricate stuff with the actual words themselves. Or in some ways, it's like believers in magic or magicians. They will often say that you should use barbarous names. What they mean is you should make your spells in a language that you do not personally understand. That can be Latin, it can be English, it can be anything. The important thing is when we're using language that we don't understand, our minds go all over the place. They enter into a much more receptive state. Now, H.P. Lovecraft has got a reputation as being a very old-fashioned writer who hated modernism in any form. He loathed Gertrude Stein. He wrote a very funny parody of T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land called Waste Paper, which showed that he at least understood modernist poetry, even though he affected to despise it. But I think that H.P. Lovecraft was probably a closet modernist. One of the things that he's most often criticised for is his ridiculous, overblown use of adjectives, generally talking about a creature which he will eventually describe as indescribable. My friend, the writer Michael Moorcock, has called H.P. Lovecraft that master of over-describing the indescribable, which I can see what Mike means, but I don't think that that's entirely the truth of the matter. Looking at Lovecraft, I can see that he was actually using language in a very determined way. He would overload descriptive adjectives upon some of his creatures, some of his creations, so that it would make it impossible for the reader to put together a clear mental picture. His first mention of his most famous monster, the great Cthulhu, he spends a lot of time telling you 3 things that Cthulhu doesn't quite look like. In his other story, The Dunwich Horror, he has one of his loathsome, subhuman creatures who goes by the name of Wilbur Whateley. When he is finally destroyed in an incident involving dogs in a library, he describes the dying body of Wilbur Whateley by looking at different parts of it and describing them. He describes one part as covered in thick hair. Another part is bubbling with tentacles. There are eyes in the hips. Basically, he is giving you so many conflicting textures that you cannot possibly put these together into one single image. It's a way of alienating the reader. It's a way of estranging the reader and making the reader feel that something is wrong. These are some of the ways that you can use language effectively in unusual ways, which will greatly spice up anything that you are writing. There are certainly extremes that sometimes writers have gone to achieve these effects. One of my favourite movements in literature, and this has perhaps got limited application, but I still feel that it's very important, is the Oulipo movement. Now, Oulipo is a contraction, I believe, of the French term ouvrir littéraire potentiel, an open potential literature. What this is in effect is setting restraints upon what you can write. As an example of how, say, the writings of James Joyce can affect our consciousness, I would point out my own experience when I was writing my novel Jerusalem and had for some reason decided to do a chapter all about James Joyce's daughter, Lucia Joyce, when she was confined at a mental institution in Northampton for the last 40 years of her life. And I decided to have all of this in the language of her father, which meant that I was inventing nearly every word in the story. My spell checker was having a mental breakdown, and it took me a couple of months to write this stuff. And after I'd finished it, I couldn't even think in proper English anymore. My mind had become so conditioned to making up new words out of everything that I was unable to have a basic conversation. I had to take 18 months off publishing an underground magazine before I could get back to the book and write in proper English again. Now, fortunately for you, as a would-be writer, this is not going to be a problem for a long time yet, or at least I would hope so. But be warned, this could be waiting for you some point down the line when you have degenerated to the level that I have degenerated to. Now, in thinking about how writing affects our minds, it might be worth remembering the concept that George Orwell first introduced in 1984, which was of newspeak, which is a new form of English engineered by the state with very few words, so that the actual consciousness of the people using the language is limited, so that they do not have concepts, they do not have words, they are limited in what they can think. Now, actually, that sounds pretty true to me. I think that the less language you have, probably the more easily controlled you are. But if that is true, and I fear that it probably is, must not the converse also be true? If you expand your vocabulary, if you expand your use of language, does that not mean that your consciousness will be expanding as well, as will the consciousness of your readers? So that is something which you might want to think about.